Muy buenos días, bienvenidos a la tercera entrega de la serie Diálogos sobre Innovación y Propiedad Intelectual, esta vez hablando de la propiedad intelectual antes y después de la pandemia. Esta es una iniciativa organizada por el Tanque de Pensamiento, el Instituto de Prospectiva e Innovación en Salud INNOS, con el apoyo de la Embajada Británica en Colombia, de AFIDRO y de la Universidad El Bosque. Los invitamos a seguirnos en nuestra página web www.innos.co y en nuestras redes sociales aparecemos como el Instituto INNOS. En nuestro canal de YouTube, desde donde están viendo este video, pueden suscribirse para continuar analizando los diferentes contenidos que estaremos publicando a lo largo del año. En este webinar contaremos con la participación del experto en temas de propiedad intelectual, el Dr. Philip Stevens. El Dr. Philip Stevens fundó Geneva Network en 2015. Sus principales intereses de investigación son la intersección entre la propiedad intelectual y las políticas de salud. Fue funcionario de la OMPI en Ginebra, donde trabajó en su división de desafíos globales en una variedad de cuestiones de salud y propiedad intelectual. Cuenta con experiencia en investigación y tanques de pensamiento. También ha trabajado como consultor de riesgo político y consultor de gestión. Es columnista habitual en una amplia gama de periódicos internacionales y ha publicado en varios estudios académicos. Tiene títulos de la London School of Economics y de la Universidad de Durham, en Reino Unido. También es miembro principal del Instituto de Democracia y Asuntos Económicos de Malasia. Lo entrevista nuestro director del Tanque de Pensamiento, el doctor Carlos Felipe Escobar. El doctor Escobar es médico, especialista en otorrinolaringología, magíster en dirección universitaria, fue rector de la Universidad El Bosque, consultor en estrategia de innovación y transformación digital en la educación superior. En ese momento le cedo la palabra a nuestro director para que continúe con el diálogo. Adelante, doctor Carlos Felipe.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you once again here in this series of conversations regarding innovation and IP for the future of healthcare, and mostly of the future of healthcare in Colombia, in our country. But definitely considering and doing this conversation with international renowned experts like our guest today, Philip Stevens. Philip Stevens is one of the big figures today in innovation and IP in healthcare. He is the executive director and founder of Geneva Network. So it's definitely for us a pleasure to have you today here, Philip, with INNOS. We are going to follow your advances. INNOS is a new think tank, just some few months moving on, but very excited and trying definitely to do what think tanks should do for their regions, for their countries, and that is trying to influence with evidence, with academic thoughts, with international references, how to improve the quality of policymaking in fields like this one that is both for you and for so important, which is healthcare. So definitely your experience is very, very, very important for us, and definitely building this conversation and this relation with Geneva Networks is one of the most important things for INNOS at this stage. I know that we have to learn a lot of your mistakes, but also for your many, many, many more good things that you have proved to work to function. And today, well, it's a great pleasure to have you for this conversation with the support of the British Embassy here in Colombia. And let's start, of course, with the answer that definitely when to start. Tell us a little bit about you, how you finally moved your whole career, moving to this field of innovation and IP in healthcare, and founding Geneva Networks. Tell us a little bit about Geneva Networks and what you have done to this point. since its founding in 2015, I think. And then, well, what are your plans for Geneva Networks in the future?
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. So I've been a researcher and policy analyst of IP policy for some years now. I first got involved in the early 2000s when the debate was mainly around access to HIV/AIDS medicines, and I've been following the debate quite closely ever since. So I've worked with a number of think tanks, research bodies, gone off into the private sector, done other bits of work, but I've been very closely involved with this debate and how it's evolved for the last 20 years, I guess now, and most of my career. And while during this time, and during a spell I had in Geneva with the World Intellectual Property Organization, I came to the conclusion that the debate around the relationship between IP, innovation, and health was the debate was very one-sided. There's a very dominant view, which you often hear in the universities and the public health NGOs, that IP is bad, IP undermines access to medicines, and IP should be abolished where possible. I didn't necessarily agree with that view, even though it was really the dominant view, which you hear at every panel discussion, on every press release, every newspaper article. The journalist always interviews the same people with quite negative views about this topic. So my view was that I think there was a time for a rebalancing of the debate, a time for creating better public understanding and awareness of the important role of IP, both in developing new medicines, which I think is quite well understood, but also the important role of IP in promoting access to medicines, which is less well understood, I think. And not just in developed countries, but also in countries on the up, like Colombia, other Latin American countries, and in Asia, where I think the view of IP is changing over the last 10, 20 years, whereas before it was seen as like an imposition by the US and other developed countries. Now it's seen more as a very important tool for participation in the global economy, and very crucial to increasingly large parts of industry and development, from the creative industries to life sciences to computers and so on. So IP is now at the center of the global economy. It's at the center of debates around health and innovation, especially with the COVID pandemic. And I think it's very important that the other perspectives are heard. So Geneva Network, which I founded about 6-7 years ago now. Like INNOS, we have 3 main roles. So first of all, we do original research into some of these issues, IP and the intersection between trade and health in particular. We also, a quite important part of our role is explaining sometimes quite technical and difficult policy issues to generalist policy audiences. In cities like Geneva, where a lot of policy making takes place, many of the delegates to the World Trade Organization are not necessarily specialists, and sometimes can benefit from clearer explanations of these policies and how they work, how IP works. So we produce short explainers, we write policy briefs explaining key issues, and we circulate them to policymakers. We talk to the media, we write opinion articles, and then finally, a key part of our function is to provide a platform for experts to engage with the policy debates. So we put on lots of events, and prior to COVID, we had a big event series in lots of different countries, including Colombia, which we came to in 2019 or 2018, I think. But now we're continuing that in a virtual way and hoping to resume our travels and our in-country events when time allows. Who knows when that will be, though?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that this post-COVID time will be a very, very good time to catch up with a lot of discussions that probably lost a little bit of traction of momentum, but that definitely shall start once again. But also, let's say to reorient some of the things that I would say emerged regarding IP and innovation in health during COVID. So let me start some questions regarding your thoughts, and let's begin by these let's say COVID times. Because as you mentioned, well, you said the whole motivation for Geneva Network was to do some sort of counterbalance between these story of IP being not necessary in a field such as healthcare. It's evil, bad, not good. It goes against well, many things, and then well, we need to do some counterbalance on this. So, what would you say would be the your three big myths and blames about IP during these COVID times, and what would be your, let's say, evidence, the evidence you would put in the table to say, well, those are definitely myths and blames that should not be should not continue in the conversation.
Well, I would say there were two big myths rather than three.
Okay.
So if you cast your mind back to the March 2020, around the time the COVID pandemic really became a concern and countries were locking down. At that time, we obviously had no medical defenses against COVID. There were no treatments or vaccines. And I think there was a realization that this could be quite a serious problem for the world without a vaccine. So the debate was at that time how to most rapidly produce a vaccine. And there was a lot of talk amongst academic circles, the IP academics, the health academics, and amongst the NGO, the public health groups, talking about the dangers of IP. The view was that with IP and patents, researchers would not share information. So the companies would hoard or keep all their, their secrets and their patents to each other. When actually what was needed was to share it amongst everyone, so that the quickest, that'd be the quickest way to research and create these new vaccines, which were needed at the time. As things turned out, that view was completely wrong, and shown to be wrong by the fact that within 1 year there were 3-4 new vaccines created and taken through regulatory approvals within the existing IP framework. Actually, the view that IP prevents cooperation and collaboration, which was widely believed at the beginning of the pandemic, turned out to be completely the opposite. In fact, patents and IP helped cooperation because it allowed various different companies to share information with rivals and other partners, often in different countries, safe in the knowledge that that information could only be used for the purpose in hand for COVID research, not for taking off for other commercial use and exploitation. So it created trust amongst rivals and amongst partners, and allowed a huge amount of sharing of information amongst different organizations, individuals, public, private sector, which led to the rapid creation of new vaccines, which have been very fundamental to changing the course of the pandemic. So IP has been crucial for innovation for COVID vaccines. And I think without the IP system, we probably would not be in the position we are in now with all these amazing vaccines and treatments available. How they get to people is a different question. And that, to me, is the second big myth of IP in the pandemic. So that now that we've shown that IP has been crucial for innovation and research, the new argument that IP is holding up manufacturing, and there are shortages, particularly for developing countries, caused by the IP system. Again, I don't think that's true. Are more to do with trade barriers, with regulatory problems such as countries not approving rapidly, with shortages of supplies, with taxes and tariffs and customs bottlenecks. But actually, the IP system is helping companies to manufacture billions of doses by subcontracting out various elements of the manufacturing process to partners, to trusted partners, using very cutting edge and new processes, particularly in the case of the mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. The IP there is allowing these very new technologies to be shared with trusted partners to create a safe and rapid manufacturing scale up, to the extent where we now think there'll be sufficient doses available by the middle of next year for the world. The question is how to distribute them, but the actual manufacturing, I think, has been helped by IP. And the question of distribution is not really a question of IP. It's more of a question of logistics and political will on the ground, which are two very different questions. So I think myth number one, IP has prevented R&D into COVID vaccines. It's been shown to be incorrect. And the current myth we hear at the moment is that IP is holding up manufacturing, which I also think is not true. Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry.
May I paraphrase what you have said? Something
Please, yeah.
like IP system set a common global language through which academics, researchers, industry, governments, investors, etc., agree about very quickly cooperating and developing and producing the vaccines that we are now, let's say, using for humanity. I guess that could you describe a scenario in which IP would not be in the place? What and how would this conversation and in this intention to cooperate would move?
Without IP?
Yeah.
Well, so say for example, we're talking about the mRNA vaccine, which, as you know, has lots of different applications beyond COVID. Can be used for cancer. They're even making a malaria vaccine out of it, plague vaccines. It's extremely commercially valuable. And the inventors of that technology platform are quite keen to use that in the future to develop lots of new categories of vaccines for different diseases. If they were to share that without restriction at the beginning, without any restrictions, that would probably destroy the incentives to research into those future disease areas. So it could create problems for humanity in the long run. It might mean slower development of these new categories of vaccine. And on the other hand, without the other element of this is the manufacturing of today. So say, for example, these mRNA platforms, they're very technically advanced and modern, and very few people in the world know how to actually make these vaccines. So with IP, the companies who own the IP are prepared to connect with partner manufacturing groups to teach them how to make the vaccines, how to share the very technical know-how, because that's protected by IP, and they're happy to do it because they know the use to which it will be put, and it's along that common framework that you described. Without IP, they have no control over what will happen to it. They don't know who's going to be using it, so they'll be less incentivized to help train people how to use the technology, how to set up the factories. So in reality, the factories probably won't get set up, and it'll be a much slower process than the voluntary cooperation that we're seeing at the moment, which is enabled by the IP system.
Definitely, I would say that probably even having the whole intention to cooperate, if you don't have the rules of the game in place, it becomes extremely difficult to move in this in any kind of cooperative efforts. So I think that you have
Agreed, yeah.
clearly expose the idea. But let's say that all these times, and of course you have research, and you have state a lot of things regarding this trend. We saw many kind of initiatives and proposals from governments, NGOs, etc., regarding how to move on with this issue of COVID vaccine research, development, production, etc., etc. So I would say some of them technical. I would say evidence-based built, and some other probably with some other profile. So let me try to catch from you. What would you let's say would have been the most renowned nationalism initiatives that emerge in all these process? How nationalism positions and let's say initiatives influence all these discussion.
Oh, sorry, could you rephrase the question? I'm not quite sure I follow you.
Would you address how nationalism positions from government influence the whole conversation, both research, development, production, distribution, etc.?
Well, if you think about the discussions in Geneva at the World Trade Organization, which I'm sure your viewers will be familiar with, the debate there. There's a debate there to disregard the existing global IP rules. For COVID vaccines in particular, that debate should come to a head in November of this year. That proposal was brought by India and South Africa, both of which countries have a large generic manufacturing industry. I think there's obviously a motivation there to help their own industries, which disregarding IP would. A forced technology transfer would help improve the technological capacities of those countries potentially. And obviously the countries with the innovation are keen to protect that beyond COVID, and don't necessarily see a short-term advantage in ripping up the IP rule book when the problem appears to be being resolved through voluntary methods. The question of nationalism, I think, often appears in which countries are buying the most vaccines. The US, Canada, UK have lots and lots of doses of vaccines, where other countries don't have enough. But the question that's not anything to do with the IP system. That's more about procurement and politics, at a national level. And I think if you try and unpick the IP system to solve those political problems, you'll do a lot of harm without necessarily achieving very much, because you unpick the IP system and it won't necessarily increase the number of vaccines available in total in the world, and you won't achieve much. You'll destroy a lot, and yet countries, the rich countries, will still be motivated to protect their citizens and using their finances to buy as many doses as possible. So I'm not sure that undermining the IP system will solve the problem of national political concerns.
Absolutely. So it seems like in my point of view, that the nationalism initiatives and measures, for example, the blocking trade, some trade movements, etc., definitely influence much more rather than the IP system itself. Well, even if you take a look, well, the IP is much more blamed than these kind of national issues. Very interesting to see how, for example, India was one of these promoters of the waiver, but then they when they have this big production there from AstraZeneca, they closed the export of the vaccines to other, well, to move on the local local supply. But there is when national issues definitely emerge. But have you would you have you seen, or would you catalog some sort of these measures that have emerged as populist in anywhere, in any country?
The IP issues, you
Yeah,
mean?
yeah. Well, the kind of measures that let's say have been promoted by governments of NGO. Have you seen some sort of these initiatives that could you would say this is pure populism? This is not technical. This is
Mm.
just populism.
Well, I think the waiver itself is a populist measure because I don't think even its proponents think that it will accelerate the production of vaccines. One or two people might think that, but I think the general consensus is that it won't necessarily accelerate vaccine production. And yet, their proponents still persist with pursuing it. Obviously, for some governments, it's easier to blame IP than to blame their own shortcomings of delivery. It's not just developing countries that have struggled with delivering vaccines. Australia is struggling. One of the richest countries on the planet has a lot of problems on the ground. Although I don't think they're necessarily blaming IP. In Europe, there were lots of countries who had a very slow start to delivering vaccines, even though they had the financial resources and the ability to buy doses. They had a lot of political problems at the beginning, which are seen to be being resolved now. But yeah, there's I think we have seen a lot of populism around this issue, particularly IP. I think the question is for the least developed countries, those in Africa, for example. The question should be, how to really ensure that enough doses get to that country, maybe through some big procurement mechanism, which I think COVAX already exists, but maybe better contributions to COVAX from developed countries. And then really the big question there is delivery on the ground, because healthcare delivery on the ground in such countries is always very difficult, as you see in rural parts of Colombia as well. The same issues exist in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Even if you have the doses, how to get them into arms is, a massive logistical question, and I think much more relevant than IP, particularly for COVID vaccines, which I think the political will be there to get the doses there, and there will be enough doses in production globally. The question is how to get them into arms. A lot of work to be done on the ground yet, I think. And in Colombia, do you also see similar issues at the urban versus rural areas where it's more difficult to reach people?
Well, absolutely. Colombia is a very, very diverse country. It's big, and the geography is quite complex. We have, let's say, cities with all, let's say, the facilities for logistics, but we have a lot of the small towns and rural areas with very, very with high difficulties for the provision. But I would put you aware that some weeks ago, we had a huge movement here, popular movement here against tax reform, and we have strikes all around the country and road blockage. So we face a very difficult issue regarding how to provide healthcare, and not only the vaccines, but essential medicines, medical assistance, etc. So to many ways, because these guys blocked the roads and they say we are protesting against these inequalities, the things the government do, blah blah blah, and then these kind of things go far, let's say, ahead of what you can discuss and can imagine in terms of the difficulties on logistics for vaccine provision. That's a reality. You have it, I think, everywhere in the world. So this brings me to this. I think that you have pointed it very, very well. The very diverse situation on the measures and the initiative that emerge everywhere. Some of them very technical, some other nationalist with the nationalism behind, affecting what happens really. Some of them very populist, but not so technical also. Uh, but with all of them, I would say a very strong movement or trend on the big government taking the conduction of many things, economic measures, health measures, etc., etc. So that's the kind of movement towards not a small government, but a big government that take the responsibility for everything. So, would you share with us what have been, let's say, the leaders in this uh, bigger government movement and trend, and what would be your insights for the future? Are we going to, let's say, set back and uh, come once again to, let's say, moderate sized governments or small governments, or is it going to affect our long term behavior, for example, for healthcare research and innovation ecosystems?
Um, well, that's a big philosophical question. In terms of healthcare delivery in particular, I could talk about my own country, United Kingdom, which has a taxpayer-funded centralized healthcare system, which has had enormous problems during the pandemic. They basically shut it down for 6 months, maybe longer, and as a result, there's huge backlogs, big queues waiting for even routine treatment and diagnostics. I think there's 5 million people waiting for some kind of healthcare intervention out of a population of 65 million, the worst it's ever been here. And yet the healthcare system is the best funded it's ever been relative to GDP, growing and growing, and yet becoming more and more inefficient. And I think personally, it's the lack of market mechanisms which have led to some of the problems we have here, because you have a system that's very unresponsive to patients and is very centrally driven, and it's very difficult to allocate resources effectively where they're needed, and a lot of bureaucracy consumes a lot of the healthcare budget, and that's a problem that's getting worse here. So you have few incentives for efficiencies and large layers of management that exist in the public sector. And in terms of the research and development side, I think what we've seen is quite a good synergy between academia and the private sector. I think we've seen the model wherein some early stage academic research, which is almost always funded by government, has been taken by pharmaceutical companies and taken through clinical trials, using their private sector expertise and efficiencies to develop very useful products rapidly. So I think the role for government in health has been early stage funding, and obviously the regulatory role. But in terms of research and development, I think it would be foolish for those who argue that government should take a bigger ownership of the entire research and development of drugs in order to, for example, reduce drug prices or to make them widely available for free. I think they've shown no aptitude or capability of doing that as a sector. But I think the COVID pandemic has demonstrated very nicely how the two sectors can work together for the benefit of humanity.
Absolutely. And we have seen some trend, Philip, regarding this kind of response. COVID, I would say this is the statement. COVID has shown that we are not self-sufficient to provide basic medical good provision for our citizens, mainly pharmaceuticals. That's why we need to talk about pharmaceutical security, and then it means that we need to build capacities to be self-sufficient, and in order to guarantee research, development, and production for our people. Do you think is there? Let me check. Is there some country in the world that you would say is self-sufficient for research, development, production, and distribution for basic pharmaceutical goods for their citizens?
Self-sufficient? No, I think that's a myth. I mean, even India imports plenty from China, generic drugs. The US imports plenty from Israel, China, and India. Here in the UK, we import from everywhere. We also make some ourselves. There's a lot of interconnectedness in global supply of pharmaceuticals, and I think that's as it should be. I don't think any one country has the ability to provide all drugs that all its citizens need. And for a country like Colombia, obviously it's in a process of transition. So it's moving from a commodity-based economy towards a more knowledge-based economy as it becomes wealthier, and knowledge-based industries are becoming more important in Colombia. As part of that process, inevitably, more life sciences investments will take place. People will see opportunities to cater for the Colombian market. Colombian entrepreneurs will set up companies, and yes, more Colombian companies will start becoming more important in the life science and pharmaceutical healthcare markets. I think that's an organic process that will happen with the right policies in place. But I think it would be a mistake for the government to try and artificially create an industry through, for example, taxing imports or confiscating intellectual property rights to favor their own local companies, because that way, it will really annoy trading partners and make them less likely to invest in future, and B, it's not really the sustainable way to create a thriving healthcare sector, which no doubt will come eventually. 20, 30 years, I'm sure Colombia will be one of the key life science hubs in South America, maybe overtaking Brazil.
Well, we definitely hope so, and that's the whole purpose of the discussion. We want to move in from INNOS. I need to tell you that right now we see, let's say, two trends here in this discussion. Government is moving, I would say, towards strengthening IP policy, and let's say building on the international agreements and well, cooperation. And indeed, very recently, the National Minister of Education announced let's say the first clear initiative for a public-private partnership with Sinovac in order to explore this possibility to strengthen capacities here from national pharmaceutical labs, and being able to move on with vaccine production. But also a national initiative emerged from industry to also produce biologicals here. It's called Baxtera. And then we have, let's say, these two initiatives that move with this mind frame: cooperation and a role between public and private cooperating, national and international agents moving on, and cooperating, of course, with the universities. And then we have another initiative, this one led by the Congress, a specific party in the countries that say we failed providing and guaranteeing the security of access to medicine and vaccines. We some years ago we were able to produce some vaccines. We need to regain all this self-sufficiency. So They're proposing to create a big corporation that is in charge for the research, development, innovation, production, and distribution of basic medical goods, including vaccine, but also other goods. So let's see what happens. Anything can happen in countries like ours through this discussion. But I guess that what will be your choice in terms of recommending the course of action for a country like ours?
Well,
Philip, but let me hear your thoughts. Do you experiment two, let's say, big counter direction initiatives in countries like yours or other countries? What will be your suggestion for us?
well, I think the countries that have been successful have created an environment that's enabling. So they haven't tried to force things to happen. They've created a policy environment that enables businesses and entrepreneurs and researchers to come together and to work. So they've kept taxes low. They've reduced import tariffs. They have a strong IP framework that allows investment and cooperation. The regulatory environment is sensible. The quality of living is good, so scientists are happy to come and live and relocate. So it's a multifactorial policy ecosystem. If you get all those things right, and you have the scientific capacity, which I think a country like Colombia does, good things will happen. Whereas if you try and force things through, for example, confiscation of IP rights, through high taxes of imports, and so on and so forth, it will create a local industry that will achieve something, no doubt, but it won't go to the big heights and become a regional player, because no one will be interested in investing from overseas. And I think overseas investment for any country is crucial, not only for the money, but also for the technical skills that the foreign companies bring to the local companies to help upgrade technological capacity. So international cooperation and collaboration is the absolute key, particularly in high-tech sectors such as the life sciences. So policies that create the ability for foreign investment to come in, foreign knowledge, technology, those are what the government should be looking at, rather than creating barriers or fortresses for the local companies to have a protected existence. I think those are the key things for future growth.
Absolutely agree. Philip, try to share with us and to look for something related IP regulation that has not worked during pandemic and should be changed in the future.
Well, compulsory licensing, wherein a government can override the patent of a medicine, has not been a useful tool in this pandemic, because vaccines are not really about patents. They're more about the know-how and the trade secrets which underpin manufacturing. So the government needs to look at policies which will encourage local companies to share trade secrets, because they can only be taught voluntarily. They can't really be forcibly taken, unlike a patent which anyone can read and reverse engineer a drug. So compulsory licensing to me has been a useless mechanism in this pandemic, and people, I think, policy makers should forget about it and look to the policies which might actually help.
Absolutely. One final thoughts from your side,
Sure.
Philip, because I'm afraid that what lies behind all these conversation between against IP regulation and patents, it's let's say a sort of point of view of mind frame in which everything is related to let's say this unfair guarantee of rights to some company or some individual. Yeah, and then
Yeah,
people stand in this position. But you have explained very clearly that IP set the stage for human, government, industry, and academic cooperation. Yep.
correct.
How can we shift the mindset, shift completely the conversation regarding IP to this kind of IP is a tool for us, everybody, to cooperate, to allow that our generosity to cooperate from what we do from each of our organization it's fruitful and moves on. How can we can do that?
Yeah, I think we need to change the terms of the conversation, the debate. I think people misunderstand. They think that companies want to keep everything to themselves. Actually, the motivation is to sell as much as possible, and to get as much product into people's hands as possible. And IP has been a useful tool to doing that. And I think the way to explain to people is to use the example of COVID, because it's been a great example of how cooperation has taken place between lots of different people and companies and universities and lots of different categories of organization. And use that example, use other and find other examples which exist in other disease areas, and try and speak to policymakers, try and ensure that your voice is heard in the media. Often you don't hear voices like ours in the media on these topics. So don't be afraid to put yourself forward to the media and speak to journalists. Try and build those relationships to tell your side of the story. It will be a long road, but I think the evidence base is there. It's just a question of explaining it again and again, and working hard.
Yep, absolutely. But I guess what you mentioned is something like let's stop defending IP, and let's share with the people how it has been the tool for human cooperation and to
We should be more positive. We should be more positive rather than defensive, I think, about IP.
definitely, Philip. And I think let's try to consider one series of conversation regarding this between you and what we can do from here from INNOS. Why not how IP systems have let's say allow cooperation for research, cooperation for development, cooperation for production and logistics, and you will find we will find out for sure examples in each of these stages that have been critical for our response to as humanity for COVID. Last some last insights from your side, Philip. Future of IP regulation. Would you say is the future of all these IP conversation around the world, and mainly building on the experience that we have during these times of COVID?
Well, there are two big changes. So, firstly, the rise of biotech, biological medicines. Sorry, my children have just come in. I'm going to shut the door.
Don't worry.
Luckily, it's not live. I'll start again. So, two big changes. Firstly, the rise of biotech, biological medicines, which are made from living organisms. Patents aren't necessarily the key IP right for those, but IP rights such as data exclusivity. So we'll see much more talk about that form of IP to protect the investments there. And then secondly, we'll see much more high-tech drug development, so artificial intelligence, machine learning. There'll be IP questions around ownership of medicines that are created by machines rather than individuals. So we'll see probably patents becoming less important over the future, and other forms of IP becoming more important. So those are the two big changes that I see over the next 10, 20 years. So the debate will change, no doubt.
some suggestions regarding universities and people training future medical doctors regarding their understanding and their awareness about IP?
Yeah, I'm not sure they currently get any training on IP. I know the World Intellectual Property Organization does some great introductory courses which are online. People should sign up to those. And they often do them in collaboration with universities in different countries, so they're tailored for different countries and different languages. Yeah, people should sign up to them and learn a bit more. I think a lack of understanding of IP could hold people back, particularly those who've got a great idea for a new product or medical technology and don't know where to start with protecting it. So a good point. Thank you.
No, thanks to you, Philip. Definitely, it has been a very, very nice time, a very good conversation, and you share with us, great insights regarding all these things that, are the mission of both of Geneva Networks and INNOS. I sincerely appreciate your time and your generosity, sharing with us your insights, your knowledge, what you have done from Geneva Networks, and for sure, we would like to continue this conversation and this
Indeed.
cooperation for a long time. Okay,
it's been a pleasure talking to you.
And definitely great to have you here as soon as conditions allow us to do some work face to face here in the region.
I can't wait. I love to come. Bogota is a great city. I can't wait to come back and visit again.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, Philip. So thank you very much. And thank you all of you that have shared with us this conversation. And I hope that you have also get a lot of insights from Philip in regard of these very, very, very important issues that are determinant for the future of healthcare, for the future of innovation in healthcare, and the kind of transformation that all of us want for our healthcare systems. Thank you very much, and keep in touch with our future conversations.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Muchas gracias al Dr. Philip Stevens por su participación en esta tercera entrega de los Diálogos sobre Innovación y Propiedad Intelectual, una iniciativa conjunta con la Embajada Británica en Colombia, con AFIDRO y la Universidad del Bosque. A ustedes, gracias por conectarse. Los invitamos nuevamente a seguirnos en la página www.innos.co, también a que nos sigan en nuestras redes sociales, a que se suscriban en este canal de YouTube y a que continúen observando cada uno de los contenidos, revisando cada uno de los contenidos que estamos constantemente publicando desde el tanque de pensamiento. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Les deseo un excelente día.